This is Brian Lasser, President of Xenix Software. In this session, I'm going to show you how to test a PowerBuilder application with AscentialTest. I'm going to start out by giving you a brief company background, and then I'll introduce AscentialTest, including the step-based testing approach, and I'll give you a thorough demonstration of all of our primary features. I'll also talk about our platform support and give you a glimpse of the product roadmap. Our founders are the original creators of QA Partner and SilkTest in the 1990s. After we left Segway Software, we formed a company called Star Quality, which is an automated consulting firm in the New England area. I mention it because we learned some valuable lessons during that period. When we eventually founded Xenix in 2006, we had a mission to build a testing tool that makes testers more productive. What we were finding was that it was taking too long to develop test automation. We also learned that a lot of the folks that wanted to automate tests were not programmers. They didn't have scripting skills. And so building robust automation was beyond their reach. We decided we wanted to build a tool that was accessible to everyone on the testing team. More than anything else, we learned about test maintenance. And we learned how when applications changed over time, tests were breaking, and it was taking just as long to maintain those tests as it took to build them in the first place. Clearly that's a problem because it makes it difficult to get a good return on your investment in test automation. So you'll see as I go through the demonstration that we have found numerous ways to reduce the cost of keeping those tests up to date so that they're ready when you need them. AscentialTest started out as an automated testing tool, but it's much more than that today. It's a comprehensive testing suite. We start with test planning. We have modules for test development and management for automated testing, manual testing, and test data management. We have a module that's specifically dedicated to managing the test execution process and in generating reports and metrics. We also integrate with other tools in the application lifecycle, including defect tracking, version control, and continuous integration. I'm going to start by talking about test planning. In our test planning module, you describe what it is that you plan to test. From working with a lot of customers, we've come to the conclusion that there isn't just one format for developing test plans. So what we've done is we've developed an editor that's flexible. It allows you to write outlines, tests, or scenarios. So it will support any of the broad categories of test plan format. No matter which way you decide to format your test plan, that plan will provide a way to group tests together for selection and execution. You'll see in a few minutes that you actually execute your tests directly from your test plan. And we integrate your plans with the manual and automated tests that you create with AscentialTest through drag and drop. In fact, you're going to see that we heavily use drag and drop in AscentialTest because it's an efficient way to build and execute tests. Now I'm going to introduce you first to this application that we use for demonstrations. It's a PowerBuilder Ultimate application, and you can see that we can put in employees. We can open employees so that we can verify the information that we input about the employee. It's also an order entry system. We can put in purchase orders, ordering things like t-shirts and hats and things like that. So throughout this demonstration you'll see that I make use of both of those modules. Now we're in AscentialTest here, and you can see that I've got a project that I've already started called PB Ultimate Demo. Now I'm going to start out by showing you some different test plans so that you can see the different styles. Here's an outline-based test plan. This is the kind of test plan that I prefer, but I've also got a list-based test plan. It's actually the same plan. It's in two different formats, but the information is exactly the same. I could also write scenarios instead. Now I've written a fair amount of detail there, but I could write a whole story if I want to. Now I do prefer these outline-based test plans because they can expand and collapse and you can drill down, but you can see that I have this description tab so that even though my test plans tend to be a little bit concise, I can put all the detail that I want to down in that description area. Now I want to talk about a feature that we call attributes. Attributes are important because they're labels that help me find tests, and I can create as many of them as I want. They're user-defined. You can see I've created one already called test type, and I can select positive or negative. And I can thus label my tests that way. And then if I decide I want to, say, run only the positive ones, I can actually execute a query, which I'll show you in a few moments. It's very easy to add a new attribute. I just come into Project Attributes and I give it a name. So here I'm going to give it the name Test Level. And I've already created a type for test level, but I could have also made that just a string if I wanted to not have a pick list. So here you can see I'm displaying my test level across my test plan, and I can make selections like regression and smoke. You'll notice that if I label something regression on a node that has children, that the value actually gets inherited by all the parents, from the parent. Now I can override that at any level if I like. Now I'm going to show you how I can execute a query. Your queries are stored here and marked by query, so once you create a query, you don't have to create it again. I've got one already created that will find all my positive tests. So if I got a new build and I wanted to execute some tests quickly, I didn't want to execute all of my tests, I can execute that query and it'll pull out or find all the tests that match my query, all the positive ones. Now AscentialTest also has something called a suite. Suites allow me to group plans together. So I'm going to create something here for you called Example Suite. And you'll see that all I need to do to create that suite is drag my plans into the suite. The beauty of the suite is that if later on the plan changes, the suite will automatically be updated. So I'm dragging all of my plans into the suite. Now if I wanted to execute more than one plan, I can do that because I have a container for all of my plans. I want to show you some other ways that you can use our test planning tool. Not everybody writes test plans, and we recognize that. So you can go into what we call insert mode, and you can simply use the plan as a container for your tests. You can also execute a test with multiple sets of data. So I've got this test plan with this one test, and I have different sets of data. I can simply select multiple rows and all, and you'll see that the little all shows up down below under the row ID so that I can execute the tests with multiple sets of data. And here you can see a result of what that looks like. Now I've also created a plan for the purchase order section. And let's say, for example, that I want to run a number of tests more than one time. Maybe I want to stress out some resources. Now let's talk about building tests. Our tests are built upon a sustainable library. We create something called app objects that you're going to see in a moment. But that's not the only kind of object that we support. App objects are for real objects like push buttons and drop downs and text fields. But in some applications, there are images that you would like to see as an object. So we have a way of handling those kinds of objects as well. Likewise, we have a technology that will see text that's painted on, say, a canvas that isn't a real object, so that you can recognize and manipulate text as objects as well. So this is our object library, and that library is a stable foundation upon which tests can be built. And so you see the rest of the testing project is built upon that object library. When a new version of your application is released, you might update the definitions of those objects, and then the rest of the testing project is automatically updated. So this is one way that we're reducing the amount of maintenance, the level of effort and the cost of maintaining your tests, again, so that your tests are going to be ready when you need them. I'm going to talk about capturing application objects. In this process, we're defining all the application elements in an application. Elements like text fields and push buttons and radio lists. In this process, we provide a name for each one of those objects. We do that because we want these objects to insulate the test from changes in the target application. What that means is that if the target application changes, you can go to one place and change the definition so that your tests are not impacted by that change. Now you'll see in a moment that AscentialTest defines these objects automatically in a drag and drop interface. It's a highly visual process where feedback is provided to ensure that each object is uniquely defined. Now here I've got a page in my application, and I'm going to take something called a snapshot. And you'll see that little dialog box there that says Snapshot Captured. What we've done is we've taken a picture of that application dialog, but you'll see in a moment it's not just a picture. It's actually a full implementation or a full record of that application. You can see here that we recognize all of the objects that make up that dialog. You see here we see the table, we see the header of the table, we see the detail. So this is a data window, obviously. We see all the rows, and we see all the columns in the rows as well. So AscentialTest knows everything there is to know about that data window, so that it'll make it easy for us to recognize it, manipulate it, verify it. We've got all that information. Now to define the object, we simply take and drag and drop it. And you'll notice that we've defined the dialog box, but not only the dialog box, also the objects that are contained in the dialog box. So in this case, those buttons and the data window. And notice again that as we click on the columns, we recognize all the columns. The green check marks and those numbers are the feedback that we give you so that you can see that we have uniquely identified the object. Now, I've worked with this definition already, and I want to show you another feature called a selector. A selector is really important in PowerBuilder because we have so many tables. And you'll see I've created a selector called Select by Product ID. So I'm going to select a row based on a value in the Product ID column. Now I can test that selector by putting in a value, and you'll notice when I put in 400 it finds the row where the Product ID is 400. If I put in 700, it's going to find the last row where the Product ID is 700. Now that's not the only way I can find a row. Maybe I want to find a row based on the name of the product. And so here I'm going to put in the value of shorts, and you'll see that it does identify the last row. You can create as many selectors as you want, and you can even combine them when you're using these selectors in your tests, which I will show you in just a little bit. Now we also have something called a series. A series is a series of snapshots. It basically tells a story of the transaction that I want to automate a test for. And as I click on all those thumbnails, you can see that I've got that series of snapshots here. To add another snapshot to my series, I simply take the thumbnail and drag it and drop it. I'm going to go ahead and associate that snapshot with an object, because then it makes it easier for me later on to locate that snapshot. Now, just like we had a library of objects, we also have a library of something that we call a step. In AscentialTest, we're going to build our tests with building blocks that we call steps. And so we're going to build up a step library, and all of our tests are going to be built upon that library. It's a stable foundation upon which to build our tests. When a new version is released, we update the impacted steps, and all of the tests are automatically going to be updated. So again, another opportunity for us to reduce the cost and the level of effort of maintaining your tests. It makes you more productive. And it ensures that in this environment that we're in, where we're rapidly developing and deploying software, that your tests are ready when you need them. Now let's talk about building tests with steps. As I mentioned already, tests are built with these units that we call steps. Each step is made up of one or more actions. Some examples of actions are setting text to a text field, or selecting from a drop-down list, checking a checkbox. These are all examples of actions. Now you'll see that I'm going to use parameters to separate test data from actions, because I want to promote reusability. That's a very, very important concept. Because you see, these steps are meant to be used over and over again. Once I create a step, I don't have to create it again, but I might be using it in 10 tests, 100 tests, or even 1,000 tests. And the reason for this is that if the target application changes, I can go to the step that's been impacted and change the step. And like I showed you in that diagram a few moments ago, all of the tests are automatically going to be updated. So we're significantly reducing the level of effort again to maintain your tests. You'll see that these actions are captured in a drag and drop interface that's easier to use than a recorder. Now here I've got that snapshot again. You saw that snapshot earlier. And I've got my object already defined. Now, aside from just defining the objects themselves, I can actually define the values of those objects. For example, when it's a drop-down or a radio list or a list box. So I'm capturing the values of those objects so that later on when I want to create my test data, I don't have to remember the abbreviation of Connecticut or Massachusetts. I can simply pick it from a drop-down list. Now I'm going to add a new automated step for you, and you'll see that I'm going to use the snapshot in order to do that. I'm going to make it a little bit larger just so it's easier for you and I to see. I'm going to start out by giving the step a name. I'm going to call this Add an Employee, and I'm also going to give it a description. The description is useful because then later on, when I want to look at my steps over in my library that I'll be showing you in a few moments, I can just hover my mouse over the name and I'll see the description. Now this little panel below the snapshot allows me to add what we call actions to our step. And you can see that there are set actions, verify actions. And there's a number of things that you can verify, not just the value of the object. I can actually get those same values as well. I can select an event, which typically are things like using my mouse and my keyboard. And then we have an other category for everything else that didn't fit neatly into one of those other categories. So this panel again allows me to add actions to my step, and I do that by dragging and dropping. So I'm going to drag over the object, and you can see that because I've selected set down below, it's going to create a set action. Now I don't have to do them one at a time. I can hold down my mouse like I'm doing here, and I'm selecting a number of items. This is just faster than doing them one by one. Holding down my mouse and clicking the different items that I want to set a value to. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and drag them all over as a group, and you'll see that we've automatically generated a number of set actions. I could select values if I want to. You can see that the values are there in the drop down for the state. Remember that state string that I created. So I could do that if I want to, but I really don't want to because I want this step to be data generated. I want to be able to use it over and over again with many sets of data. So I'm going to add parameters to my step. And so you can see that by clicking OK on that button, AscentialTest added a parameter for each one of the actions, and it did it in the correct type. So in this case it used that new restricted string called state string. You'll see later on in this demonstration where I will actually put the data. But for now, I've parameterized it. Now I want to use that button, that save button, in order to click. I want to click it in order to save the new employee that I'm about to add. So now my step is complete. I've got all of the actions that I need to fill out the form and to click the Save button. Now notice that when I hover my mouse over that new step, that I see the description as a tooltip. Now I'm going to create another step for you to verify the employee. So we have steps that are going to set values. We may have steps that do verification. Again, I can drag and drop, and notice that it actually grabbed the value that was in the snapshot, although I'm not going to use that value because again I'm going to want to parameterize. And just like before, I'm holding down my mouse and I'm selecting the fields that I want to verify. And I'm just going to drag them over as a group. So I'm going to verify all those values to make sure that the employee got added correctly. So I'm going to add parameters again. And when I click OK, all those parameters get added. Now we also have something called app metadata. And this allows me to do different things. Like for example, if I want to add an action that fills out the entire form, I can do that by just dragging over the form. So instead of having all the fields vertically, I can do one drag which will fill out the entire form, and then I can parameterize that as well. Now AscentialTest's step editor also allows me to do things like declaring variables. I can put in statements like if statements and so forth. Here I'm going to go ahead and add an if statement. And maybe what I want to do is I want to verify that this window exists. So I'll put in a timeout for how long I will wait for the window up to that point. When I click the update button, notice that my if statement gets written for me. And then anything that I drag subsequent to that will be nested under the conditional statement. So AscentialTest gives you help with creating things like conditional statements and loops and things like that. We also expose our library. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to maybe check the database to see whether or not the new employee was added. I could drag over a database connect, and I can drag over an execute and a fetch, and I can get all of the values that are going to come back from that SQL query. I'll show you what I've done previously. You can see that I've already created a query against the database. So I could verify in more than one way. In this way I can verify using the database itself. So I can verify my test using the GUI, or I can verify using the database. Now I want to show you how you can use a selector in a test. And here I've got my data table, and there's my selector. In this case I have a selector called Select by Last Name. So let's say that I want to select a row based on the last name. So what I can do is I can click on the row, and you'll notice that the row shows up with just a number in it. But that would only select the first row all the time. That's not really sufficient because, you know, this is an application where I'm going to be adding more employees. The row number might not always be the same row. So instead what I want to do is I want to use a value to select the row in my table. So now you can see that I parameterized how I'm going to select a row in my data window. Now that we've learned how to create steps, let's learn how to create a test in AscentialTest. Tests are built by dragging and dropping reusable steps. You'll see that the data tables are automatically generated and linked to the tests. And then the tests are going to be integrated with the test plans again by dragging and dropping. So I'm going to create a new test for you. I'm going to add a test. I'm going to start out by giving the test a name. I'll call it Verify New Purchase Order. I put in a description and a group. This might look familiar because it's very similar to the way we develop our steps. But here what I'm going to do is take those steps that I created and I'm going to drag them and drop them. So I'm taking some steps that I created and I'm dragging and dropping those steps into my test editor. In this case I'm going to be creating a test using that purchase order section of the target application that I showed you. So I'm invoking a new purchase order, I'm adding a new order, and then I'm verifying the items in the order. So I've got 3 steps. Again, remember they're reusable. Now I could put the data directly here if I want to, but I'm not going to do that. And in fact here, notice that I'm going to pass parameters from one step to another. So the item data that I put in, I'm going to pass to the verify. The order number that was generated by the system, I'm going to pass to the last step. But the rest of the data, I'm going to ask AscentialTest here to create a new table for me. AscentialTest knows the parameters and it knows the types of the parameters. So all I really have to do is give it a name of the data table. And the data table is going to be automatically generated for me. So there's my data table. But before we put the data in, let's look back at the test and see what happened to the test. The test has been updated by AscentialTest. We put in a query to that newly generated data table, and we've associated the data requirements, those data fields, with a column in the table. Now here I've blasted the data in so that you didn't have to watch me type it, but you can see I have my sales rep, my customer ID, and my items. I can always add another row to my data just by clicking on that plus sign. Now I'm going to take my test and I'm going to drag it and drop it on my plan. That's how I associate a test with the test plan, simply by taking the test and dragging it and dropping it. You notice the green T shows up. If I click on the green T, notice how the test is displayed. Now I don't have any data yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this icon here, and my data table is going to pop up, and I'm going to select row 1 because that's got a single item in it. Then for the next one, I'm going to select row 2. I've defined 2 items that I want to purchase there. And finally, row 3, and you'll notice that there are 3 items in my list. So all that was done by dragging and dropping. Notice I didn't have to create any spreadsheets or anything like that. AscentialTest did that all for me automatically. Now the reason why we're doing this, why we've developed this step-based approach, why we've developed these application objects, is because we want to increase productivity. Steps are created automatically as actions are generated in that drag and drop interface. It's easier to use than a recorder. Tests are built by dragging and dropping steps, as you just saw, and then we generated the data tables automatically and linked them to the test actions. Finally, you saw me take the tests and integrate them with the test plan, again by dragging and dropping. This produces tests that are robust and flexible, just like those that would be hand scripted, but you were able to do it without having to learn a scripting language. Some of the advantages are that we've reduced the learning curve. We're clicking instead of coding. We've increased your productivity by eliminating the need for you to create a framework. With other tools, you may spend weeks or months just creating the framework before any tests are developed. It eliminates these layers of spreadsheets that you see with some testing tools. We've also made it easy to manipulate complex objects, like the data window. This improves your return on investment. Reuse means a reduced effort to create tests, and reuse also significantly reduces test maintenance. And this is the gotcha in test automation, is where you spend as much time maintaining your tests as it took to create them in the first place. AscentialTest also supports manual testing. Manual tests are built using the same step-based approach as automated tests. This facilitates the transition from manual to automated testing. Tests can combine both automated and manual steps. For example, you can add a manual verification step to an otherwise automated test. Or you can put an automated data lookup, looking up data from your database, for example, and insert that into a manual test. Now, to create a manual step, the process looks pretty similar to an automated test. In fact, the editor is the same editor. I'm going to give my new step a name and a description and a group in order to organize those steps. Now in this case, I'm going to type in the instructions. I'm going to add the instructions that are going to be the instructions that the manual tester follows. I'm going to click on the New Order button, and you can see my manual step is in the library. And if I hover my mouse over it, you can see the description. Here's another manual step that I created ahead of time, and you'll notice that this one has a parameter in it. So you can parameterize your manual steps just like you can your automated, because we expect these manual steps to be reused just like in the automated test. Now here I'm going to create another test, and this is going to be made of manual steps. I'm going to start out the same way as when I built my automated test, by giving it a name and a description and a group. The groups are for organization purposes. Now notice how similar this is to automated testing. I'm taking my steps and I'm dragging them and dropping them. The process is identical. The only difference is you might notice that the icon in front of those steps is blue, whereas the icon for automated steps was green. That's really the only difference. So I'm taking my steps and I'm dragging them in order, one by one. And I'm going to pass the order number again from one step to another. And then the rest of my parameters are going to be created in a data table. So you can see my data table editor there. And it's picked up all of the different parameters of all the steps in the test. I can remap one, by the way. You'll notice that if I'm using the list of items, say to input, if I want to verify the same thing, I can use the same parameter. Then I simply remove the duplicate parameter. I'm going to go ahead and give my table a name. And then when I click OK, the data table is going to be generated again. Here again, you notice that the table is referenced, and all of the parameters are referring directly to a column in the database. I've blasted the data in again. And notice that's a list of records there, that list of items. So our data is not just simply simple objects or simple data items. It can be complex data as well. I'm going to create another plan for you. So I've got a plan called Purchase Order Tests, and I'm just going to put in a little bit of description here. We've got our purchase order regression, and remember they're data driven, so I can use the same test over and over again with different sets of data. And here I'm going to add an order with 2 items. So I'm going to take my test and I'm going to drag that test over and drop it, as you'll see in just a moment. Notice my manual tests are blue, whereas my automated tests are green. So I took the test over and I dropped it. And now I want to select a row in my data table. In this case, I've only got one row for this demonstration. So I'm associating it with the row. Now, when we run a manual test, this dialog box pops up on the machine where I'm testing. It knows who I am, it knows what time it is, it knows how long it's taking me to execute the test. It's capturing all this information. I can pass each one of my steps one by one as I'm following the instructions. So maybe I'm new to the department and I don't really know the application that well. Well, this dialog box will guide me through manually testing the application. Again, I'm following the instructions and passing the steps as they pass. It's giving me all the items. In this case, I'm going to select this particular item number. Wants me to add another item, number 500. And I'm going to order 2 of those. Now it's asking me to save the purchase order and capturing the number. So I need to capture that number because I need that number in a subsequent step. So you notice I put the number in, but then that is recorded and captured so that when I need that number, it will be there for me. So if I want to find that particular order, I've got the number there. And now I can verify the items and the quantities. And if I wanted to, I could have done the item totals, but I did the order total there. So that's been presented for the manual tester, so they don't have to calculate that on their own. I can also take pictures. So you notice I took a snapshot of the screen. I could add attachments, I could add notes, and all of this stuff will show up in the results file when we look at the results of the test. So anything that the manual tester wants to record will get recorded into the results. Now here you see the results of a test. You see the plan and you see the test passed. That's what the green check mark indicates. And I can look at the output of the test and I can see all of the steps and all of the actions. I can see any notes that the manual tester took. If they took a snapshot, I can click on that icon and see what the application looked like. Maybe there was a failure and I'm going to want to extract, for example, a PNG from that snapshot and attach it to a defect report. Now we've learned how to create steps and how to create tests. Now let's talk about managing the test execution process. We've built something called a test set as a way for you to manage the test execution process. You'll see in a moment that we present an overview of your testing progress. How many tests have passed, failed, been blocked, not run, or currently running. This is all in real time. Test results are stored either locally or on a centralized database server, and reports can be generated from either AscentialTest or from a portal that you access from your browser. Test results are integrated with Jira for defect tracking and pretty soon TFS. Let's now take a look at the test set feature of AscentialTest. Test sets, as I said, provide a way to manage the execution process. I'm going to create a new test set for you, and I'm going to start out by giving my test set a name. I'm also going to put in a build number. You can always add build numbers later on as you execute your test set, because these are meant to be test sets are meant to be kept around for the entire release of a piece of software, so there may be many builds. And you can see there's an overview, and you can see that the test plan has been pulled in. Now I'm going to open up another version of really the same test set, but one that has already been executed, because now I can show you a lot of the interesting features of the test set feature. You notice up at the top that 6 tests have been executed. They've all failed. 1 is blocked, and there aren't any running currently. I can block a test and provide a reason code, and then you can run reports on those blocked tests to explain, for example, to your project leads or your managers why some tests haven't been executed. You can see the results not only of the most current run, but of all the runs. And you'll notice in this case, this test has failed the last 3 times it was executed. It did pass initially. We can also look at the output of each test. So this gives you a trace of the test itself. This one did not get very far. AscentialTest has integration between AscentialTest and, in this case, Jira. And you'll notice that if I click on the identifier of the defect, you'll see that my Jira application opens and I can read the details of the defect. Maybe I'm going to be retesting and I want to understand what the defect was before I start my retesting. Now I showed you attributes earlier in the plans. Those attributes are available here in the test set as well. And I'm going to use those attributes in order to mark some tests that I want to execute. So you can see that my query found only the positive tests. And when I go to run those tests, a dialog box pops up. I can put in a build number. I can also decide whether or not I want to have reports automatically generated and email those reports to my distribution list. I can say turn off different classes of tests. Maybe I don't want to run the ones that have passed already, or I don't want to run the manual ones. Now I'm running my tests, and you see that I'm running against the target application, the PowerBuilder application, and it is running very quickly because AscentialTest will run against the application as fast as the application will allow it. So I'm running my tests, I'm ordering my products, my shirts and my t-shirts and my baseball caps. And I'm doing my verification as well. So I'm putting in orders and I'm verifying those orders. When the test is finished, you see now finally the tests have passed. So I've got 3 green check marks. All 3 of those tests have passed this time. Now, perhaps I had a run that was bad. Maybe the environment wasn't set up correctly. I can simply delete that run and then all the results will be subtracted from the test set. I can also annotate my test set. Perhaps there were failures and I want to inform the auditor or the reviewer that it's okay to release the software, for example, even with these defects because maybe they were minor in nature, maybe cosmetic. You saw there I could attach test strategy. This is an interesting feature. Here AscentialTest is notified that a defect has been fixed, and AscentialTest will automatically find all the tests that are associated with that fix to make it easy to run those tests, to either reject or accept the fix. Now once I have results, I'm going to want to generate some reports. Here I'm showing you a pie chart. So this gives you a picture of your automation, the percentage passed, failed, blocked, not run, and running. I could also generate a detailed report. Here you can see a report that shows what looks like our test plan, and you can see which tests have passed and which ones have failed. And of course I could export into any of those popular formats. Not everyone has AscentialTest on their desktop, maybe project managers and managers, but they still want to be able to track projects and generate reports. So from their browser, they can look at the results of any test and generate any report. So you don't necessarily have to distribute reports to folks on the project team that don't have AscentialTest on their desktop, because everyone has a browser and they can get the results directly from the browser. Let's take a look at the supported platforms. AscentialTest supports more than just PowerBuilder, as you'll see. Regular Windows applications are supported. We support the main browsers, along with CEF and Electron and Salesforce, Ajax, Angular, NetForum. We support PDFs, so if your application generates PDFs and you want to verify your PDFs, we support that. We have support for .NET, whether it be WinForms or WPF, and of course PowerBuilder. We support terminals like 3270 and 5250. We support PuTTY. ODBC, I talked about that earlier. We also have a library to parse and write XML. We control the operating system, and of course Java. Other AscentialTest features that we didn't get an opportunity to talk about in this demonstration include things like integrating with Subversion for version control, executing tests remotely or on multiple machines at the same time, using our scheduler to schedule tests, or using the command line, which makes it very easy to integrate with other tools like Jenkins. We have image and text recognition. I talked about that a little bit earlier. We also have a very sophisticated image comparison. In summary, I've given you a basic understanding of the step-based approach. We've looked at the primary features of AscentialTest, including the test planner, the object repository, the step builder, and the test builder. We also looked at manual testing with AscentialTest, and finally, test execution management. We're in the process of integrating with TFS right now. We're also going to be looking at integrating with requirements management, and next year we'll be supporting mobile platforms as well. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and if you have any questions, of course, you can contact us at www.xenix.com. Thanks.